Good morning, everyone. I'm Walter Earl, visiting professor here at the Perry Center of the National Defense University, and I want to thank you all for being here. I want to welcome you and thank the distinguished ambassadors from Trinidad, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua for being here with us, and the high-level defense and diplomatic officials. It's also a pleasure to welcome the online audience. We have this event is being live streamed via the internet to Miami, throughout the Americas, to the world beyond, and we actually have a large internet audience, as we understand. It includes the Minister of Energy and Mines from the Dominican Republic, Honorable Pellegrin Castillo. It includes an audience gathered at the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica in Kingston, Jamaica, and it includes other audiences as well. So I want to say a word or two about the format we're going to follow. This is a Davos-style discussion, which means that I, as moderator, will pose questions to the panelists, who I will introduce momentarily, and what we'll do is everyone has received a card with their program coming in, and we'll take written questions, which we will collect at the break. We're going to run from now until I'll say 10:20, and at the break, we'll break until 10:30. At the break, please submit your questions out front to the registration desk, and please write legibly so that I can read them. And then during the second half, we'll answer questions. And for the audience on live stream, we'll take questions via live stream chat. So you can send in those questions during the first half of the discussion. And then in the second half of the discussion, we'll try to answer the questions. But there won't be a chance to simply raise your hands. You'll have to submit your questions in writing at the break. I want to say a word also about the subject. We're talking about energy issues in the Caribbean basin, but we mean to be expansive about this. It's La Cuenca del Caribe, but it's also an area of interest and activity of countries like Brazil and Canada that don't border the Caribbean, and obviously the much wider world has a big impact on energy issues, so it's not meant to be excessively exclusive. So let me introduce our panel members, and then I'll say just a word or two of overview, and then we can start. So our first member is Juan Gonzalez, who is the Vice President's Principal Advisor for Western Hemisphere Affairs and the lead for the Vice President's Energy Security Initiative in the Caribbean. We have Bob Eichord from the Department of State, Deputy Assistant Secretary. He's filling in for Amos Hochstein, who was required to attend a different meeting, but we're very lucky to have Bob, who's an expert in energy transition and transformation. We have Professor Frank Mora from Florida International University, Director of their Center for Latin American and Caribbean Affairs, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs, former professor from NDU, former player coach for the softball team. And we could go on all day, but Frank, very glad you're here. And Jorge Piñon, who is a former industry executive, energy industry executive, now head of the Center for Energy Studies at University of Texas. So let me just say a couple of words about energy issues in general before we start. And obviously, energy is important. Everyone knows that. A couple of recent examples that come to mind was a statement in The Economist magazine saying that energy and finance are the only two industries that have shown that they are capable by themselves of throwing the world into recession. Another example, a recent newspaper headline saying corruption scandal at Petrobras threatens Brazilian economy as a whole. Brazilian economy is the 7th largest in the world. That's pretty dramatic if one company can threaten the whole economy. There are a lot of developments in world energy. Obviously, the fall of oil prices, which, according to the CEO of ExxonMobil, are likely to stay at the level of maybe as high as 70, but anyway, considerably lower than before for at least 2 years. There's the shale revolution in the United States, which means that the U.S. is closer and closer now to being energy sufficient and may soon be an exporter of oil and gas. There's the energy deregulation in Mexico, which is likely to lead to new investment and more production. There's the continuing decline in energy production in Venezuela. There are the commitments that have been made at international meetings on climate change, which will impact the production of and use of fossil fuels. So we're in a very dynamic atmosphere that's likely to affect particularly the small countries of the Caribbean and Central America, who depend, like everyone else, on energy for their economies, and who have the highest energy costs in the whole region. Obviously, to address these costs, they'll need more new external private sector investment. But the inconsistencies in regulations among the countries make it hard to attract that investment, just as high electricity costs in the countries make it hard to attract investment in other sectors. So given the situation, what is U.S. policy? Well, the president issued a new national security strategy last month that highlighted energy, but also highlighted the need to take on the climate change issue. It also highlighted that U.S. prosperity is impacted by the economic health of our trade partners in our region. Vice President Biden launched an energy initiative in June 2014, followed up with a summit, an energy summit with the Caribbean in January. For the Defense Department, our quadrennial defense review in 2014, which is our guidance, our overriding guidance, highlighted energy and climate change as issues affecting the national security environment. So in this atmosphere, what needs to be done? What can be done? What are the trade-offs? What are the potential impacts on defense and security? So why don't I start with one, maybe for an overview of Vice President Biden's initiatives.
Great. Thank you, Walter. Morning, everybody. I'm honored to be here, particularly with this group, which I've learned a lot from over the years. In fact, I may be the special advisor to the Vice President on Western Hemisphere affairs, but I know that on energy issues in particular, I feel like I work for Amos Hochstein and Bob Eichord. I basically do exactly what they tell me to do. So, and the cooperation with the Department of Energy and, frankly, just the whole of government effort behind this has been excellent. But let me take one quick minute first to talk about just why it is that the Vice President's engaged in the Western Hemisphere, and then talk about what our kind of concept is for North America and what that means for the region, particularly the Caribbean, and then I'll be very brief on just this Caribbean Energy Security Initiative that the Vice President launched last year, and then I'll turn it over to the experts. This has been, over the last 2 years, I think, we've had the most active pace of engagement by this or frankly any administration in a very long time. The President was in Mexico last year for the North American Leaders Summit, and he's received a series of leaders from the region in the Oval Office, including Chile, Mexico, and others that I'm not mentioning. The Vice President has traveled to the region since 2009, 11 times, most of those during the last year. He's been to Colombia 3 times. He's been to Mexico 3 times. He's been to Brazil 3 times. He just came back from his second trip to Guatemala, where he advanced our efforts to support Central America's efforts to address the security and developmental challenges that they're facing. So you guys you've seen that. If you're reading the press, you're seeing what you're not seeing is behind the scenes. Our government has been maintaining a very active pace of work to look at what more we can do to kind of advance our relationship with the Western Hemisphere. And it's based basically on the thought that there's just incredible opportunity, right? And there are things that we actually need to challenge in terms of our just normal conventional wisdom, how it is that we've operated, and how our traditional relationships to the region have been. Cuba policy change is perhaps the best example. You have a president who, during his first term, signaled that this is the way they were headed, and then he announced this. And so we're looking right now at what more can we do to actually advance it, and we depart from a basis of respect from the region, a focus on equal partnership. And the Vice President's been very committed to that. He may be somebody of Irish descent, but his sensibilities in terms of the way he manages relationships are ones that I think appeal very much to the Western Hemisphere. He's developed very positive relationships with all the leaders that he's met. Now, one thing that you'll always hear him say is how North America is really a platform of opportunity, be it on political issues, economic issues, what have you. As we work to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership, North America is the center of that from our perspective. But also the passage of energy reform in Mexico has kind of completed this North American vision of an energy secure North America. But what does that mean? I mean, North America is certainly Canada, Mexico, and the United States, but it also means Central America, the Caribbean, as very important parts of that. And why is that? It's because when you actually have, you have this drop in oil prices, as Walter had mentioned, you actually have an opportunity where North America can work in places like Central America and the Caribbean to promote these sorts of issues. And so that's been our focus. And in the run-up to the Summit of the Americas in Panama on April 9th and 10th, when the President travels, what we've been doing in advance of that is seeing what more can we do beforehand to really push the envelope. So actually, I think it was May of 2013, the Vice President traveled to Trinidad and Tobago, met with Caribbean leaders, and one of the main issues that they raised was, look, Caribbean energy security is a major challenge that we need to deal with, and he committed to working on the issue in partnership with Amos and Bob and the Department of Energy. We worked on this initiative that we would propose to leaders, and when he traveled to the Dominican Republic on June 19th of last year, he rolled out the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, and it's basically, it's not a prescriptive solution. It's not, we're going to help, we're not going to solve the problems here. It's basically departs from an understanding that anything that the United States does will not work unless the countries of the region actually take significant steps to reform, for example, the regulatory structure that impedes investment, frankly. Right now, I think the World Bank estimates that the region requires $12 billion of investment by 2035, which is more than the United States or any donor country can provide. So the basic tenets of the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative were, number one, if we get the governance right, it opens opportunities. Number two, these are countries that have very high borrowing costs. The financing picture is very challenging. We can help with that. Donors can actually help with that. And then the third step is donors have been present in the Caribbean for a very long time. We can do a much better job at coordinating our efforts. So since he announced the initiative, we've been working very actively with these governments, and it all kind of came to fruition at the January 26th Caribbean Energy, the first ever White House Caribbean Energy Security Summit, where we agreed on a joint roadmap to actually work on these things together. And some of the main deliverables that came out of that were the United States actually committed to forming a team of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation so that we could actually increase the number of deals that the private sector invested in the region. The second thing that we actually came out of that meeting with was an investment network, which is to say the World Bank is actually going to work with the multilaterals and others that were at the summit, including the EU at a very high level. You had the Mexicans were there. You had organizations like the Carbon War Room and others to actually maximize what donors are doing, because we can be duplicative, frankly, and maybe there are places, there's not a one solution that will apply to everybody. Every solution is unique, and so how do we actually maximize these efforts? But the most important part of it was this commitment by leaders to actually take ownership and actually trying to fix the regulatory structure to create an environment. You have these isolated islands that are very small markets that frankly dissuade investment. So regardless of the presence of OPIC or any financing structure that you have in the Caribbean, if there are no bankable projects or if nobody's willing to invest because the markets are too small, it's not going to work. So what these countries need to do is they need to get bigger. And they do that by actually having regulatory structures that create economies of scale. We're not done yet, though. So it's something where, for us, this is an all of the above solution, where the solutions, obviously right now there's a dependence on imported diesel, but there are opportunities here to advance renewables, geothermal, hydro. Some companies are investing innovatively in natural gas. And we're looking at every single option. So it's something we're going to continue to work on with these leaders and make sure that it's a solution based on just partnership. So I think I'll leave it there and then maybe turn it to Bob. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Juan and Walter, for inviting us. I'm sorry that Special Envoy Hochstein was not able to make it today, since, as Juan mentioned, he's been sort of the point person working with the Vice President's office on these initiatives. But I've had the good fortune to work with the Energy Bureau over the last several years, because it's been a process it precedes the last summit 2 years ago, where we had the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas. But then at the summit 2 years ago in Cartagena, we worked with the Colombians to launch the Connecting the Americas initiative for Central America and other regions. And that has, in a sense, been followed by, as was mentioned, an increasing engagement and involvement, especially at the highest levels, to, in a sense, further the importance role that energy has in the development of the Caribbean and Central America and the broader region as a whole. I think the first point I would make is that there has been a profound transformation that's taking place in the international energy markets. After roughly 4 years of unprecedented high oil prices, then in a sense the supply-demand situation has created obviously a tremendous fall in the price of oil. But we still should remember that those high prices over those 4-year periods had a big impact on countries around the world, especially in the island states in both the Caribbean and Pacific, for instance, that were so highly dependent on oil imports. So you had electricity generation prices that were 30, 40 cents a kilowatt hour. So real pressures to meet the requirements of economic growth and provide secure energy at the same time and deal with this vulnerability to high oil prices. The other, and of course, the revolution in terms of oil and gas production in the U.S. has been remarkable. Obviously, we've seen that play out in many different ways. We're on the verge in the U.S. of starting our LNG exports next year and becoming a major LNG exporter to the world. And that obviously has importance for all the regions of the world and for prices of gas in the world. And I'll talk further about that later. The other, obviously, key revolution has been in the commercialization and prices for renewable energy technologies. So we've seen, in a sense, what used to be technologies that were in the range of 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour come down to 10 cents or less per kilowatt hour. So compared that to 30 and 40%, it's a pretty much a no-brainer for the Caribbean countries that they can, in a sense, have competitive sources of supply in the future and use their indigenous resources and develop their capacities to meet their needs with these resources. And together to diversify supplies, diversify imports, develop these indigenous resources. So we are very optimistic that, in a sense, that the countries have an opportunity to really take advantage of these different trends to reduce their vulnerability and dependence, to develop, in a sense, and chart new ways of meeting the energy needs of their systems, both centralized and decentralized. And that, as Juan said, the key issue is creating that investment climate and creating the policy environment, the regulatory environment, improving the utility operations and efficiency, creating the mechanisms and agreements for investors to feel confident about their investment, and last but not least, working with the consumers to ensure that the consumers' needs and ability and affordability of energy can be maintained. So I think that we see a big challenge. We see that the New Caribbean Initiative will, in a sense, unlock additional resources throughout the U.S. government, but also hopefully from the private sector, because that's the key. But we need to be in partnership with the countries to, in a sense, create those kinds of reforms and environments that will be conducive to this private investment, because $12 billion for the Caribbean, probably twice that in Central America is going to be required. So a lot of money is needed, and the donors and the IFIs cannot provide that money, all that money. They can be helpful and catalyst, and we're working with them. Part of the initiative to create an investment network that will, in a sense, be able to have a strong partnership with the private sector too, and the countries in the region to try to say, how can we improve that investment environment? So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Walter, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to come back to NDU and see so many old friends, so many friends. So I'd like to, just in the brief time I have, talk about 3 points, one of which was already mentioned, but it's worth reiterating. First, at FIU, where I am now, we, in December of last year, hosted the release of a report. The Latin American Public Opinion Project of Vanderbilt University came out with its 2014 report, and we hosted their launching of the document in December. And there were some interesting findings in that report. I'm not going to go through the full report, but as it relates to the topic, I'll give you a couple. One, for the first time since the report, since they've been doing the study, I think it was 14 years, security was at the top of Latin American concerns. Even in Uruguay, right? Security was at the top. It used to be sort of unemployment, sort of economic, social. Now it's security. Second finding is that for the first time in a while, the report reveals a declining support for democracy. Now, it's still above 50%, right? It's not but there is I don't know if it's a pattern, but certainly a trend moving in the wrong direction. That is to say that people are increasingly unsatisfied with the quality or the performance of democracy and democratic institutions. That fluctuates, depends on which country, but the trend overall is downward. Now, one of the things that came up for the first time, and it's not at the top, but one of the first things that came up as a concern for Latin Americans is energy. Is energy. Now, I don't know why. The question wasn't asked, well, why is energy a concern? But it did come up. One suspect that it is either the prices or the expectation of prices going up. Now, why do I mention these three? Security, increased security concerns, lower support for performance of democracy, and energy first appears on the list. I think you can make a connection between these three as we look into the future if the energy issue is not resolved, right? Because if, in fact, subsidized energy sources disappear, and even though the price of oil or diesel, et cetera, have declined significantly, if in countries where they feel where there is insecurity, perhaps growing economic challenges, you add this to the mix, I suspect that in 2 years, the issue of democracy will continue, or the support for democracy will continue to decline, combined with issues of security, right? So you cannot separate, in my mind, my point is energy, democracy, and security. The three are linked. And if any of these two go south, so to speak, the other will also decline. And this should be a real concern for all of us thinking about security issues, thinking about democracy and the strength of democratic rule. These are issues we need to be thinking about, and I'd like to explore some of that later in the discussion. A second point I'd like to make, and it's already been said, so I won't spend. This is not a hard issue, right? I mean, there is generally a consensus, right, on we need a better legal framework, right? This is a governance challenge. We need transparency to do what? To attract investments, right? If there isn't sort of that predictability to make the investments in infrastructure, right, then, that dog won't hunt, as they say. Now here, there are some examples. The Dominican Republic passed a law in 2000 that made the system much more transparent, much less bureaucratic. Prices are not determined by some bureaucrat, etc. But here the challenge is, again, issues of governance, legal framework, transparency, predictability, because governments do not have the resources, either those in the region or the United States, to make the investments necessary to build a capacity that many of these countries do not have at the time, right? Finally, and here is something that we've been talking, is political will. So political will has become my hobby horse. I want to hear, not because Juan is here, but I want to emphasize what the Vice President has said, not just about the energy issue, but also about his remarks, his op-ed, et cetera, about Central America, right? I think he has been very clear, right? Very, very clear, and almost ad nauseum, that this is on them. This is on you now, right? Yes, we're going to make an investment. Yes, we're going to support. But you have to show the commitment, the follow-up, the political will to make it happen. Otherwise, we will fail, right? I think the same applies to the issue of energy. Now, it's not as sort of urgent, perhaps, as the issue of security in Central America, but it is a problem. And I think the approach of the Vice President administration is to do that. We're going to support you at multilateral institutions. But at the end of the day, you all have to collaborate. You can't have one electrical system in one country and decide you don't want to share, right? You have to collaborate. You have to coordinate. When I was in government, I used the word shared sovereignty, and I got into a lot of trouble. I'm no longer in government, so I'll say it. Shared sovereignty, right? And that goes to the issue of energy as well as the issue of security. Well, let me leave it at that.
Good morning, and thank you, Walter, for having us here. The fun is that I'm the fourth guy after these three guys, so now I really get to go at it, and they have certainly made my job a lot easier. I want to bring about 5 quick points from the non-political diplomatic side of defense, looking more at the private sector and looking maybe not so much strategically, but tactical issues that I think that all of you need to be aware of. And I'll make some general comments. First of all, about Walter's comment about the Caribbean. For all of you that do strategic work, if you think that your country is totally isolated in energy issues from the rest of the world, you are making a major mistake. Oil today is a true worldwide fungible commodity. And if you don't think that the drop in Libyan crude oil production is going to have an impact on St. Lucia or Guatemala or Peru, you are wrong. The energy world doesn't have any borders. And if you think that it's a Central American issue, or you think that it's a Caribbean issue, or you think that it's an Andean issue or a Southern Cone issue, strategically you're making a major mistake. Crude oil and petroleum products are true fungible commodities, and LNG is on its way of becoming a true fungible commodity. The other issue that we have had at UT for the last year or so, and we finally got together between Macomb, the LBJ School, Law School, is when we talk about energy. We no longer talk about energy at UT. We talk about electric power and fuels. 2 different subjects strategically. Cars and tanks and ships don't run on electricity, they run on fuels. And we sometimes get bogged down when we talked about energy and we think that it's an easy crystal ball that we can manage. Strategically, when you do your studies, when you do your risk scenarios, you have to look at electricity and you have to look at petroleum fuels. Extremely, extremely important. Otherwise, we get into this bucket that is energy, when strategically we have to think at it from 2 points of view. Oil prices is having an unbelievable impact in the industry, but it's also having an impact strategically how we think. The conversation in Houston is that $50 oil or $45 oil is having an impact of cash flow in the operating oil companies, and therefore they have to adjust their operating budgets. They have to adjust their short-term capital investment. But there's another discussion going on in Houston on the 8th or 10th or 42nd floor of the Shell building, for example, and that is not where is the price of oil today, but where is the price of oil going to be 3 to 5 years from now. In fact, that is the question and debate within the oil companies. The $40 oil actually, in a way, even though it's hurting quite a bit of folks, it's good news. It's usually a slap in the face of our industry. You see us getting rid of assets that are no longer value. You see now companies beginning to acquire other companies. Repsol just bought Talisman at a very good price. Repsol just bought Canadian Talisman at $40-45 reserve barrels. I mean, now you're going to see a lot of opportunities in the marketplace. So short-term, $38 or $40 barrel impact cash flow. But the question is, where is the price of oil going to be in the next 3 to 7 years? Because that's what it takes to bring on a capital stream project. In other words, if you drill a deep water well in the Gulf of Mexico or in Brazil, it's going to take you 3 to 5 to 7 years to bring it on stream. If you're going to build a petrochemical plant, it's going to take 3 to 5 to 7 years. So the big question is not where the price of oil is today, but where's the price of oil going to be in the next 3, 5, 7 years. Extremely important. On electricity, I'm just going to say that the issue of electricity, whether it is the Caribbean, whether it is the Andean country, or whether it's Central America, is the same, and that is that It is not an economic challenge. It is not a financial challenge. It is not technology. It's not even the contractual model. We do have public, private sector type of investment models that are applied, concessionary models that are applied today that are acceptable by the private sector and the public sector. The issue is, as Frank well said, political will. And countries have to be sure that they have a common regulatory policy, common regulations, because you need the economy of scale to make things work. Now, it is a big challenge politically. I'm not a politician, I'm not a diplomat, but Frank, it is a very big challenge when you look today at the situation that we have with Europe and Russia and the Ukraine and the natural gas pipelines. I can see the position of a country saying, wait a minute, you mean that my neighbor is the one that is going to have the on and off switch? It takes political will to address those issues. So I think we talked about that. It is not economic, it is not financial, it's not technical. I think it is political will. Let me quickly jump to finish up about fuels. Latin America today, fuels demand is about 9 million barrels a day. The refinery capacity in Latin America today, the boilerplate refinery capacity in Latin America is about 7.6 million barrels a day of refinery capacity. But the refinery capacity in Latin America only runs about 70%, 78% of capacity because they're all refineries and they're low conversion refineries. So Latin America today is short about 3 million barrels a day of petroleum products. And the only new refinery that has been built in the region is the Petrobras refinery in Abreu de Lima. Colombia has done some work in both Cartagena and Barranquilla, but there are really no new refineries being built in the region. The United States, for the first time since 1947, is a net exporter of refined products. Let me repeat that again. For the first time since 1947, the United States is a net exporter of refined products. We're about 4 million barrels a day of exports of refined products. Half of that is going to Latin America. The United States has become the de facto refiner for Latin America. That's why we look at electricity and we look at fuels separately. Two totally different scenarios that we have to follow. And then we have to take into consideration issues like Petrocaribe, the financial impact of Petrocaribe, which we can talk about, by the way. What is the impact of $50 a barrel? What is the impact of Petrocaribe by PDVSA owning 50% of the refinery capacity in countries like Jamaica and the Dominican Republic? People forget that most of the deliveries of Petrocaribe, if you look at the biggest chunk of the volume, is crude oil to those two countries, not refined products. By the way, the United States exports to the region twice the volume that Petrocaribe supplies to the region. The United States is a larger supplier of fuels to the Caribbean. Keystone Pipeline. Mexico began now exporting oil out of Salina Cruz in the Pacific to South Korea and China. Why is Mexico doing that? Because Mexico sees a future in which there would be a Keystone Pipeline, which, by the way, we support, and I think strategically is the way that this country ought to do. But what the Keystone Pipeline is going to do is that it's going to bring heavy Canadian crude into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's more likely will back out heavy oil from Venezuela and Mexico. So the Mexicans are already thinking we have to expand our market. So even the Keystone Pipeline is going to have an impact in our region. And last, talking from the point of view of Venezuela, we are now, together with the LBJ School, taking a look at the day that Venezuela has a model change in their oil development program. Venezuela today is the largest holder of reserves in the world. If you look at the production years ratio of Venezuela, it's about 164 years of oil. Venezuela's 5-year plan for the last 15 years have been to double their current production capacity from 2.3, 2.5 million barrels a day today to about 5.5, 6 million barrels a day. Have you guys thought, or have you guys taken into account in your strategic review, what happens if there's an investment model change in Venezuela that allows the private sector to come back into Venezuela and monetize those resources? And then what would happen to oil prices if Venezuela all of a sudden, in the next 5 to 7 years, in fact, in Venezuela it's probably less than 7 years, most likely 5, Venezuela reaches a production level of 6 million barrels a day. What impact will that have in crude oil prices? So to close it, I think if there's a message that I'd like to share with you is when you do your strategic review, please be very careful how you look at energy and how you address energy. It is really electric power generation and fuels, two different animals that you have to take a look at it when you do your work. Thank you.
Well, thank you all panelists, and I thought we were going to have time for a round of questions now, but we got a little late start and we ran over, so it's really time to take our break for the audience to be able to submit questions out at the desk out front, and so we'll take a break until 10:40 and come back here at 10:40. There's restrooms outside to the left, and there's also coffee. So thank you very much, and we'll start again at 20 minutes to 11. second half of the program, please? Please take your seats so we can start the second half of the program. Please take your seats so we can start the second half of the program. So we've gotten a number of questions, very interesting and in some cases very challenging questions, and both from the audience here and the audience online. But I wanted to give
100 years. So it's not like we have a supply problem. This is not a supply problem anymore, right? This is infrastructure. This is an investment, a legal framework problem. This is a political will problem, etc.
In fact, we call it back at school. We call it the issue is the shovel. It's not an issue of geology. If you look at shale. Come on, guys. We have known about shale for the last 60, 70 years. The issue with shale was that the economies were not there to develop the technology that needed to monetize those resources. I was telling Walter, we were talking back there, and I said, the reason that we have $50 oil today is because of $100 oil. If we did not have $100 oil, we would have never been able to monetize all those resources on the ground. If we would not have had $100 oil, we would not have had the advantage of renewable technology resources that are now becoming economically. So for those of us that complain about, high oil prices had a huge advantage to us. On the issue of natural gas is and should be the fuel of choice for base electric power generation. If you look at the region, hydro provides over 50% of the electric power in the region. But on periods of drought, look at Brazil, look at Venezuela when it was, 5-6 years ago. The backup fuel should be natural gas. Let me share something else with you about natural gas. There are many power plants today, especially those of you in the Caribbean and Central America. All that you need to do is do flex fuel facilities are your power plants where you can switch your burners, and the technology is already there to either run fuels, liquid fuels, or natural gas. In fact, most companies today will do a contract with you on a BTU basis, where they'll sell you the fuel on a BTU basis, and then they'll tell you whether they're going to deliver oil or natural gas. The Cubans today are building a regas facility in Calicito, which is outside of Cienfuegos. Their number 3 unit at the Carlos Manuel de Céspedes plant already has been converted to run biofuels. Even Cuba is getting ready to a future scenario in which LNG and natural gas is going to be the fuel of choice. So there is no question, Frank. I think that natural gas, again, electric power sector, is going to be the fossil fuel of choice versus oil or coal. Correct. I mean, within the fossil fuels, if you do want, let's face it, it is a fossil fuel, but within the fossil fuel matrix, it is the one that today is the cleanest. And from a logistics point of view, we have the technology. We have the technology to transport it. Look at the Dominican Republic. Look at the Aguirre plant in Puerto Rico. I mean, it is there. It is proven. And like both of you guys have said, I mean, it's political will. But yes, natural gas, certainly we have the capacity as a region to be the fuel of choice for electric power.
So maybe I can comment on the U.S. policy dimension. I think if tomorrow, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, if tomorrow the United States made a national interest determination to export natural gas, it would not go to the Caribbean, right? Investors are going to sell that gas to Asia. And why is that? It goes back to the original motivation for the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, is that the big money is not there to be made in the Caribbean because there are so many regulatory challenges, right? So natural gas, I think, has to be part of the solution, right? And it's something that we need to consider, but it also needs to be, we don't want to change the dependency diesel to the dependency on natural gas. You want it to be gas. You want it to be geothermal, solar. And there are opportunities when you're actually looking at where you're making these infrastructure investments to do gas and to do others. So I think that's something that we want to encourage. And, we're some of the evaluations of the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative have applauded by the Atlantic Council, by the IDB and others have applauded it as a very good medium to long-term plan and have encouraged natural gas as a solution that actually can be made now. And they've made the recommendation that the United States should do a national interest determination just for the Caribbean, right? And so look, and there are things that Caribbean leaders have asked us, and it's something that's part of an active conversation. But again, we go back to the original argument, which is this is not a silver bullet. If you guys actually have non-competitive environments where your regulatory structure is unruly, it's not going to fix the problem. So I think it's important that as we consider these solutions, that we go back to the issue that it's a response, and then to kind of maybe do a corollary to Frank's shared sovereignty issue. I think it's a shared responsibility where you're actually trying to expand these markets. That if they don't actually take the first steps, then there's nothing we can do that will be a silver bullet to solve the problem.
Let me jump in here with a couple of comments. It's interesting, last year we had the Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum in Miami, and we had a meeting with all the Caribbean states and discussed, and natural gas was one of the areas that we focused on. It was interesting because I would say a lot of the countries were seriously looking at natural gas imports. Not just LNG, but LPG and CNG as well. Like the Virgin Islands is importing LPG very effectively for power. And so I think that at the same time, there were other countries that were really looking to other renewables, geothermal and solar and wind, et cetera. I think going back to my point about diversification, I think in today's world, given the uncertainties with regards and the cyclical nature of the petroleum industry, which we know from years and years of experience. I mean, I worked back on the solar energy, Jimmy Carter's solar energy initiative, and we were, so talking about, well, what happens if oil goes to $50 a barrel and then oil dropped to $10 a barrel? So, you've got this cyclical development that's going to hit. So, to hedge the bets there with regards to the future, the fuels issue, in a sense, diversification really makes sense for almost any country to use your indigenous resources, but also to look at how do you diversify your import sources. And here I think that, you're starting in the Caribbean with the fact that you've got, Trinidad, Tobago is a major exporter, but you also have, in a sense, now the expansion in the Dominican Republic of the LNG import facilities. And then you have a lot, and I've talked to a lot of the oil companies and other commercial entities, and they are looking at how do we serve these small markets? Okay. Through barges, through special development of vehicles that could, in a sense, have a hub and spoke approach to the region. And so I think the private sector is going to develop, in a sense, a strategy that makes sense to try to deliver those fuels, and especially if the economics, work out. Yes, the markets are small, and that certainly limits your ability to develop LNG receiving terminals, or even floating LNG terminals, which now can be put on really quickly. I mean, we've been working in Pakistan, for instance, where they put one on in a little over a year. So you can put on those facilities very quickly at much less cost than building a fixed facility. So I think, but going to the point of diversification. So the countries have a good renewable energy base, but these sources are intermittent. So one of the big challenges is how do you handle the intermittency? Storage is coming along, but it's still expensive. Well, to me, the obvious answer from a clean energy standpoint is natural gas. To meet peaking requirements, to meet load where you have larger loads that require that kind of thing that can balance the system and overcome the intermittency problems. And the good news is, just like on renewables, that now you have, in a sense, gas systems that are so much more efficient. I went to the GE distributed generation facility in Texas. So you have now systems that are 20 megawatts or so that are 40% efficient. I mean, that's what combined cycle efficiencies were 20 years ago. So you have a much more economic and efficient way of using the gas to meet those requirements in your diversified markets. And I think a lot of people share that perspective. I don't know that we have official U.S. policy on that, but clearly, in a sense, we want to develop efficient, reliable systems that can meet, and also I think we build in the issue of resilience, because the vulnerability to climate change events and other things are ones that we know from the Hurricane Sandy and others that are important aspects, certainly in this region, and to have systems that can be reliant and deal with those kinds of events and have a combination of both distributed as well as larger centralized units will give you more resilience.
Let me go now to the questions we've received, because we've gotten quite a few questions, and it's a real challenge to combine them because they cover a very broad range, and some of them are pretty in-depth. So let me just start with two questions that came in from the group of Perry Center alumni at the PCJ Auditorium in Kingston, Jamaica. They're different questions, but they relate to the same overall theme of diversity and governance. First question is there a role for nuclear power in energy development in the Caribbean region? And the second question is, 50 hertz is the common cycle per second in many Caribbean countries. However, this is not universal throughout. Will the Energy Security Initiative contemplate making this standard across countries? Who'd like to take the nuclear question?
Well, I've heard Secretary Moniz say that, in a sense, that we're going to have modular nuclear reactors by the year 2013 or so. I mean, 2023. They're working on it. It's developing. 100 megawatts, nuclear units, mass-produced, underground, deal with the safety issues, etc. But it's not here now. And who knows what the cost will be. So normally today the economics require a system of at least 1,000 megawatts and a $5 to $7 billion investment. I would say, that makes it difficult for most of the countries in Latin America to consider that option at this point. But in a sense, as I said, technology may indeed come up with some safer, reliable ways of producing electricity for markets that are much smaller. And so that's, I guess, one approach that we can take to the issues. You need to plan, sort of look at that as a potential option in the future, but at this point it's not commercially viable.
And how about the 50 hertz common standard?
Well, for the island communities, obviously, you can connect these systems through underground DC connections that don't necessarily require that they be on the same system. Would it be more attractive to investors and manufacturers? Yes, it would, but I'm not sure that that's the highest priority.
We have a question from the counselor in energy affairs at the Embassy of Venezuela, which is the following. A few days ago was the extraordinary summit of Petrocaribe in Venezuela. This had the presence of all heads of state members. This meeting ended with major commitments to strengthen cooperation in Petrocaribe. In your opinion, what is the role that the organization should develop in the future? That's the question. What should be the role of Petrocaribe in the future?
That's a tough question. But So look, I think from the outset, since the question came from somebody from the government of Venezuela, there has been speculation about the United States actually trying to deploy an anti-Venezuela strategy in the Caribbean, which is really not what we think about when we think about U.S. policy toward the Western Hemisphere, but rather it's a pro-Caribbean strategy. And so it's incredibly in our national self-interest to promote, as the Vice President has said, a hemisphere that is secure, democratic, and prosperous. Ultimately, when you have a prosperous Mexico, a prosperous Caribbean, it's good for us. It's good for U.S. business. It's good for politics. So the effort in the Caribbean is basically to make sure they depend on nobody, including the United States. They should be depending on themselves. You want countries that are self-reliant. Countries like Aruba are making significant investments in renewables. We want to support that. Jamaica is doing some really interesting things. And so I think any country or any kind of association that is supporting that goal to actually create an independent Caribbean that is actually encouraging outside investment, I think it's positive. So I think be it Venezuela, be it the United States, be it Canada, which has a very strong presence in the Caribbean, I think that should be the goal, is actually to promote a region that is completely independent, that is working together to increase the size of their markets and attract investment.
Brief point on this. I think, well, first of all, I think we're already seeing cuts in Petrocaribe supplies and subsidies to a number of countries. I'm not sure that emergency meeting, or if it was an emergency meeting of Petrocaribe, was to say, hold hands, everything's going to be okay, let's keep going down the same track. I think there had to be a discussion there about where do we go from here in light of the situation that we find ourselves with the price of fuel and this internal situation in Venezuela. I suspect that we will continue in very subtle ways, right, to see cuts in the amount of fuel deliveries to a number of countries. And that has to be of grave concern, right, to a number of Eastern Caribbean countries that are a member of Petrocaribe. I just don't think that Petrocaribe, even in the best environments, but certainly this is sustainable in the present conditions, right? And so there's got to be some serious adjustments that the Venezuelan government needs to make, however important that is for their diplomatic effort in the region. They've got to be thinking about, the bottom line on this.
It's worth pulling the thread on that. Sorry, Jorge, I'll be very brief. Obviously the Venezuelan government will decide what's in its interest. We're not in the business of telling other governments what's in their own national self-interest. But, for those of you that understand the way the Petrocaribe program has worked, right now countries can actually go to markets and they don't need to go to Petrocaribe. But the implications are negative on the fiscal side, where before they actually had a padding. And that has implications for the economies of these countries. And so you've seen, if you've been reading the newspapers, that there was a deal where the Dominican Republic debt to Petrocaribe was something that was actually put on the market. So you actually are getting into a situation where there's a secondary market developing for Petrocaribe debt. And I think countries in the Caribbean are wondering, what does this mean for our economies? And so what is in the interest of the United States is to make sure that it's in nobody's interest for there to be some sort of radical fiscal adjustment in the Caribbean. That would be bad. And so one thing that we've been doing is trying to see what mechanisms, what tools do we have in place to actually help countries become more independent, be it financially or on the energy side. The IMF has a very important role to play. The IDB has a very important role to play. And we're looking at our own kind of toolboxes as well.
Let me address Petrocaribe from the non-political side. And Petrocaribe, first of all, the oil and refined products that is sold to the countries under Petrocaribe, it is at market prices. So for those of you that think that Venezuela offers a price discount, they do not. And we happen to see invoices once in a while and transfer payments, and it is market price. The issue is the payment terms, that the payment terms change. So it really is a financial issue. If you look at the financial issue, depending on the market, it might not be a bad deal for me to borrow money from Venezuela, because that's in a way what we're doing. I think what Juan just mentioned is true, and in fact, we're looking at it as of a month ago. I don't know where we are now, but at $40 to $50 oil, the financial portion of Petrocaribe is 30%. At 50 to 80, it is 40%. So you have to look at the impact that Petrocaribe has on consuming countries at $100 a market and at $50 a barrel market. So you have to take a look at that. And we have seen countries like Jamaica, for example, going out in the last 3 months with big tenders for jet fuel, big tenders for unleaded gasoline that we haven't seen Petrojam in the marketplace. Our problem with Petrocaribe is the lack of transparency. We don't see any financial statements from Petrocaribe. Remember that every single country in which Petrocaribe operates, there is a joint venture between Venezuela and that particular country for the distribution of products. Where is the financial reports of those distribution companies? So there is a lack of transparency on the financial end of Petrocaribe that then question a lot of the economics. We don't know why the refineries today in the Dominican Republic and Jamaica are operating. When Valero shut down Aruba and when Hess shut down St. Croix, because they were losing cash flow. We don't know why those two refineries are still running. So again, the issue with Petrocaribe is lack of transparency. Again, I'm talking not from a political point of view, but from an analysis, private sector point of view, where are the financial reports of Petrocaribe? Petrocaribe sometimes get confused with some of the ALBA projects. There's a lot of, there's a lot of cloud and noise around Petrocaribe that really doesn't allow us to give a good economic analysis of the benefit for the countries, particularly for Venezuela.
Thank you. That's a very interesting and complete, I think, answer. So, Jorge, you just mentioned the refining issue and the profitability of refining. So let me transition to a question from Ambassador Macaya from the Embassy of Costa Rica, which is, do you think the refining capacity gap in Latin America will be filled over the next decade? And obviously this relates to investment, who is willing to invest and under what conditions?
Challenge in Latin America is that most of the refinery capacity in the hands of state oil companies. And the problem in most of Latin America is that national governments have elected to treat their national oil companies as the petty cash box. And as the petty cash box to manage populist challenges that those countries have. By the way, I recognize the political challenge when you have, you need housing, economy, schools, bridges, roads. I understand the short-term requirements and challenges of local politicians. I do not want to be in their shoes. It is the same challenge that the major oil companies are having today. How is $50 oil impacting their short-term cash flow versus long-term investment that they have to make? And in Latin America, what's going to happen is like countries like Venezuela and Brazil and Argentina are going to put whatever capital investment they have on their national oil sector, not on refining, but on upstream production. Why? Because by generating new oil or commercializing new oil, that means quick export. A refinery is going to take 5 to 7 years to build. Look at the Abreu de Lima refinery in Pernambuco in Brazil, even though the reason that its value or its cost went 3-4 times what it was supposed to be, not because of good, stewardship of the assets, a refinery today is very expensive. Mexico just announced the cancellation of their $12 billion Tula refinery. Why? Because it's more economical for Mexico to continue to import gasoline and diesel from the U.S. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, they announced the cancellation of the clean fuel strategy that they were going to spend about $5 billion to meet new fuel standards in Mexico because they said, we need that capital upstream to increase our production. By the way, we will continue to depend on the U.S. supplying us with clean fuels. Ecuador has been talking about building their new La Refinería del Pacífico, which it was supposed to be a partnership with Venezuela. Venezuela is no longer there because Venezuela doesn't have the capital to invest. Venezuela, by the way, was supposed to be 40% partner in the refinery in Pernambuco. Venezuela didn't put a penny on the Pernambuco refinery. Why? Because they had their own cash flow problems. Now the Chinese are supposed to be building a new refinery in Ecuador. I just don't see that refinery. China has also been talking about building a refinery in Costa Rica. Why? So, no, the answer to the question is no. We believe and we continue to stand that the United States will continue to be the refiner de facto for the region. And that is good business for PADD 3. By the way, our capacity in PADD 3 has been running about 91, 92% of refinery capacity, which is fantastic.
Thank you, Jorge. Very, very interesting. Well, there are a couple of questions about Cuba. Christian Gomez from the Council of the Americas asks, how do potential deep water finds in the coast of Cuba impact the Caribbean energy panorama? And David Ferris from E&E Publishing, what energy opportunities would be created for the U.S. and for Caribbean nations if the Cuba embargo were lifted and if the country were removed from the state-sponsored terrorism list? So I guess this is both political and technical. Maybe, Juan, do you want to start the political
With the
answer?
political, and then just give it all to Bob. Hey, look, when we were putting together the actual Caribbean Energy Security Summit for January 26th, in the aftermath of the president's decision to change our policy toward Cuba, the natural question was, is Cuba invited? And our response was, we would love to have Cuba here. But we have a few steps we have to take first. Let's not run. I think nations, like people, have to move one step at a time. And so the State Department has been engaged in a very active dialogue with the Cuban government on reestablishing diplomatic ties. And I think that needs to be the first step. But we look forward to welcoming Cuba's participation in this Caribbean Energy Security Initiative as soon as possible. And I think we see some opportunities to work together with them. So I'll turn it to Bob for the specifics of the deep water. Sorry.
Well, I don't have too much to say on this issue other than that obviously we've been looking at it very closely in terms of what's happening there. I think one of the aspects of any offshore development is there the environmental and safety standards that are being developed and applied so that any kind of commercial development can be proceed in a way that we have confidence it's not going to lead to major problems. I think there are a number of areas around the region where you have potentials for new production. We've been very interested in Guatemala. We're working with the Guatemalan government that has potential now for some major production offshore. Drilling is starting here this spring, and we'll see what that delivers. Of course, Mexico is beginning to go out now with new tenders to get development. So I think, we'll have to see how all this plays out. But obviously there could be some major new regional oil production in the next 10 years that is going to sort of change the equation somewhat.
Before I make a comment on Cuba, Guyana and Suriname. We believe that the 15 billion barrels of undiscovered reserves that the USGS has identified in the Guyana, Suriname, actually to French Guiana, and even a little bit into northeast Brazil, is real. In fact, Exxon is about to drill their second exploratory well sometime in the next 30 days or so. So, and by the way, strategically, we think that, and I know the State Department has worked very heavily on Guyana and Suriname. And also, the ambassador is not here, but I know that Trinidad and Tobago also has been provided quite a bit of support to Guyana. So that's going to be important. The Cuban situation is very transparent, and I will tell you this, that this is also from the Cuban point of view. It doesn't have anything to do with the situation in Venezuela today. The Cubans have recognized that they have gotten themselves into the same position that they were into the 80s and 90s, and that is that they put all of their energy eggs in one basket. Back then it was the former Soviet Union, and they went through the Periodo Especial in 1990-91, and they know that they don't want to go through that again. By the way, kudos to the U.S. State Department. The U.S. State Department at the beginning very quietly took a very positive initiative in engaging the Cuban in issue of safety and environmental standards. And them, along with the U.S. Coast Guard, have done a fantastic work in working with the Cuban governments, and the same, by the way, for the Cuban government. In some of their meetings in Jamaica, and some of their meetings in the Bahamas, and even in the meeting in Trinidad and Tobago. A considerable technical delegation from Cuba was present, and that was very impressive. So hats off to the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Coast Guard and to the Cuban government because of on their concerns of pollution and the environment. The North Shore did not materialize. There were 5 wells drilled, and there were 3 of them were dry, 2 of them were non-commercial. The other information that we have, I don't want to get involved in it. But there still could be potential. It's a very complex geology. That's all that I can add to that. But again, Nicaragua and Honduras is also looking at it, which is going to be a challenge with the EEC of Colombia. So we'll see if any drilling goes into that region. That's going to be interesting. Jamaica is trying also to look at some potential South Shore. But again, the 800-pound gorilla in the region is going to be Mexico. We do believe that deep water Mexican resources are substantial. Remember, the geology is the same as U.S. Gulf Coast geology. It's just a matter of going to the other side. So I think the potential for Mexico is very great.
Let me just say a word. So one thing that we didn't talk about when we first started this session is, and this relates to Cuba, right, Jorge, is the short term, right? So we've been talking a lot about the medium to long term and what needs to happen, but this is becoming a short term problem, or can become a short term problem. And it could be an urgent short term problem for Cuba. Because really, I don't see, Jorge, I don't see a short term solution to a crisis or some situation in Venezuela that would not cut significantly, but even cut in some ways what Cuba needs in the short. So what are the regional consequences of that beyond Cuba and for the United States? Because legal framework, infrastructure, all the things you need to do can happen in a year or two, and this all can happen, or the urgency of the issue can happen in the short term, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks.
Let me set up the question. I think I'll let these two guys at the end answer. Cuba today consumes about 150,000 barrels a day. We have done some work with Rice University, and we believe that under an open market economy, Cuba 5 to 7 years from now could double their energy consumption. But Cuba today is about 150,000 barrels a day. They produce about 50,000 barrels a day of heavy oil. So Cuba is dependent on 100,000 barrels a day of crude a day. 100% of that crude is coming from Venezuela today. Well, from Venezuela, now they're bringing Urals, Russian Urals from Bullen Bay and Bonaire, because Venezuela doesn't have the Mesa 30 to deliver to Cuba. But Venezuela is still delivering the barrels that are being delivered to Cuba are still being delivered under the Venezuela agreement, but they're now a combination of Urals because the Mesa 30 is short. But the issue that Frank is bringing to the table, it's very, very important. How is that immediate shortfall of 100,000 barrels a day is going to be covered? By the way, that 100,000 barrels a day at $100 oil is about $3.5 billion of cash flow. The good news is now that at $50 a barrel is half of that. But still, Cuba would have to go into its pocket. By the way, they have talked to Algeria, they have talked to Russia, they have talked to Angola, they have talked to a number of countries that have said, yeah, we're willing to supply you crude oil, but we can't give it to you. The payment terms are difficult. So they have visited with their friends in Algeria, they have visited with Russia, they have visited with Angola, they have even visited with Brazil. And the issue there is not crude oil supply, is how do I pay for that crude oil supply? So the question, I guess, Frank, for the U.S. policymakers is, the U.S. doesn't have a national oil company. So the U.S. cannot do something. I mean, they'll have, a Chevron or an Exxon or somebody else. Cuba will have to go into the marketplace to buy that 100,000 barrels a day of oil. I just don't see any other way.
So, without getting too much into the politics, I mean, often the vice president likes to say that often in the region and elsewhere in the world, we're everybody's problem, but also everybody's solution, right? And so the question is, what is the United States going to do to help Cuba prepare for such a shortfall? I think you need to ask the Cuban government on what they're doing to prepare. And obviously, the focus has been on the diplomatic approach that the State Department has been taking. But I also want to take a step back just on Venezuela very briefly. I think it's worth emphasizing here that just as we're trying to actually promote that it's nobody's interest to actually have the Caribbean go through a sudden fiscal shock as a result of some sort of stoppage. It's also nobody's interest for Venezuela to go through something like that. In fact, when the Venezuelan people are prospering, it's actually in our self-interest for that to happen. So it's not something the U.S. is hoping for. I mean, I'm sure there are folks that think that it's really not. And so, I mean, I think as a part of the conversations that Roberto Jacobson has been leading with the Cuban government, which is focused on diplomatic ties, but it's a broad agenda, and I'm sure these are some of the issues that they're taking up. But again, it's something that I think rests with the Cuban government as the main decider on that, I guess. Bob, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I've got one more question here that I want to be sure to get in because it kind of challenges the premise of the vice president's initiative. So it's always good to step up to critics. And this is coming from David Lemick. The question is, please explain how we encourage private investment in the Caribbean when prices are currently low, and the necessary element for success is political will, which we haven't seen when prices were high.
Hello. Well, prices may be low, but the sense of urgency is very high. And so we have been talking about energy security with Caribbean leaders for a very long time, but now it's one of the top issues we discussed, to Frank's point, that energy security is something that they're very interested in. And frankly, there are countries in the Caribbean that are already taking steps to promote their own energy independence. The conversations that the vice president led on January 26th, which included not just us, the European Union was represented at a very high level. The Spanish government was there. We had ARENA. Am I saying that right? Okay. The Carbon War Room, and all of them were echoing the same theme, that if you guys take these certain steps, we're here to support you. And depending on the leader, there were some that were very much on the vanguard of this, and they were tackling this issue. They were making major investments in their own energy independence, and we were having an excellent give and take where the European Union came and said, hey, here's something we can actually bring to the table. The government of New Zealand was represented. They've actually been doing some innovative things on, being also a small island economy in parts of the Eastern Caribbean. Others they still, I think, have some tough kind of soul searching that they need to be making because, frankly, when given the choice between a very beneficial financing agreement through Venezuela and actually making some very tough political decisions, which in some cases requires challenging invested interests in your own countries. You're essentially asking the Turkey to cook Thanksgiving dinner by actually opening up these countries to competition. That is not easy politically. Some are not ready to make that decision, but we're there to support those that are ready to make those calls.
Let me add to Juan's comments. Clearly, we are trying to pursue fairly comprehensive dialogues with a number of countries. We had a very long series of meetings with the Dominican Republic recently, and where we reviewed all aspects of the energy sector and what their plans were to improve the utilities, to develop alternatives, to improve their legal and regulatory framework. So I think that's the kind of thing that we will continue to do and expand. We're engaged with Grenada in a serious discussion with regards to the future of the legal and regulatory reforms there. And I think that together with all the other partners that Juan mentioned, the World Bank, the IDB, the International Renewable Energy Agency, the NGOs like the Carbon War Room and others, that in a sense we are now really focusing in on the issues. We're focusing in on the enabling environment issues, and we're focusing in the dialogue on the transactional aspects, and going back to the issue of how do we then strengthen get our new team from OPIC to work on the transactional issues and to try to get some of these projects moving and to link with the catalytic resources that we can mobilize from other sources. We've learned a lot from my standpoint, having been involved in Power Africa, which is another presidential initiative that is very focused on transactions and working with the private sector directly to try to identify what are those specific barriers to projects moving ahead. So we need to identify the good projects, and I think as was said, the countries are really looking at this transition and a lot of ideas and strategies to try and targets, in some case, specific targets to move toward, in a sense, a cleaner, more efficient system. But how do we move that to the project level, to the transactional level, and to the development of the financial packages that are necessary for those projects to move ahead? So it's a range of things that we're engaged in as an overall engagement and dialogue, and a lot of countries are moving very rapidly and have very aggressive targets, and we hope we can support them in those targets as we move ahead. And certainly the Summit of Americas coming up will, in a sense, give another opportunity for the leaders to, in a sense, endorse some of these transitions and give greater weight. I am concerned about the fact that with low oil prices and the substantial oil generation in many of the countries, that in a sense that there may be some resistance to the pace of change and the substitution effect. And I think that's been the case even before the decline in oil prices. There are certain interests within the countries that want to maintain that production, and therefore the transition requires a strong policy and regulatory framework and incentives to make that transition happen. So I think it's a very challenging environment, but we've got a lot of partners in both the countries and the international community to work with.
I'm afraid we're just about out of time, but I want to give each of our panelists 2 minutes to add, refine, perfect, disavow, whatever. And let me start with Jorge.
Just one note. I'll leave it there. All of you that do energy security analysis, please take a look at Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico shut down their last refinery in 2009. Puerto Rico doesn't have one single refinery. Puerto Rico went into an open access system. That means that all of the port facilities, the terminaling facilities, and the pipeline facilities are common carriers. Puerto Rico consumes between 2 million and 2.5 million barrels of gasoline a month. And the data that I have here goes back for 3 years, so you can check the data. the majority of the imports of gasoline to Puerto Rico come from Lithuania. Let me repeat that again, Lithuania. The next larger importer of gasoline to Puerto Rico is Portugal. The next larger importer of gasoline to Puerto Rico have been Sweden, and then Belgium and France. Puerto Rico has not imported one single barrel of gasoline for the last 2 years from the U.S. It has imported most of it from the rest of the world. That is due to something that is called arbitrage. And I began my conversation here today by saying that oil and fuels are fungible commodities. And as folks in the military will tell you, you can have the biggest tanks in the world, but if you don't have the fuel truck behind those tanks are worthless. So Puerto Rico today, take a look at Puerto Rico. Fuel oil, diesel, and gasoline doesn't come from the region. It comes from countries like Lithuania, Sweden, Belgium, France, and other countries. Why? Because of arbitrage. That's an important lesson to take a look at Puerto Rico and how is Puerto Rico challenging their fuel shortage today, or their supply.
Just real quickly, Walter, thank you again for the invitation. Something I said at the very beginning, sort of reiterate what Juan said. I think this is a good news story, right? This is enormous opportunity for the United States, for the region, and in our relationship, right? There are enormous opportunities to collaborate, to really fill an important, not just energy void, as I said at the beginning, important security, a potential security void that in the end will help strengthen the issue of democracy, institutions, and the legitimacy of public policy in the region. Again, the issue of political will is key, as I mentioned. So that we academics like to end in a bad note, so I want to make sure that I end in a positive note. And finally, the other thing I'd mentioned is I mentioned LAPOP at the very beginning. So we are going to include the question one of energy much more explicitly in the next round. Now, this is not going to happen for another year and a half, but we will see how this issue plays out on the public opinion poll. But I have to say, I was very surprised that the issue of energy was one of the top concerns. I wasn't so concerned that security had now passed economic and social issues, but energy is becoming, as one and others have said, sort of an important issue. And if we can address this piece, if we can make this into, and now I'm just talking from make this into a foreign policy success story for the United States, for what the Vice President and the President are doing, I think this can lay the groundwork for a number of other things. But, it won't be easy to get there.
Thank you. I think energy security, economic growth, and climate change are critical aspects of our engagement with the region. And I would argue that energy security should be defined in a broad sense, and not just vulnerability on oil imports, but other issues, as we've talked about, in terms of reliability, in terms of the transition, resilience issues, adaptation, and other aspects that relate to the situation that countries like the Caribbean face. I think, Jorge, your discussion about the fuels industry and its global ramifications for the region also applies to the technology area. Because what you've seen in terms of the evolutions of technology over the last several years has been a global phenomenon. And that's why we have the prices that have dropped today for these technologies. And that process, I think, will continue and will be given greater emphasis in terms of the broader international effort to move toward cleaner and more efficient sources. and actually Secretary Kerry's talking this morning on the road to Paris. So we have that. We have the sustainable energy development discussions and dialogue in the UN system. So lots happening this year that will focus on some of those global aspects and the efforts of the international community to achieve that. So I think that it's in that context that, one, we have global realities, but we have local politics. And we've got to sort of somehow get the local politics and move with the countries in a way that can chart these new policies that have not just the short-term political dimension, but a longer-term perspective.
Thanks, Walter, and thank you to National Defense University for hosting this, and to the panelists. These are folks I admire very much, and it's a pleasure to be on stage with you guys. Look, in closing, maybe just as a top line, when the president first came into office and attended his first Summit of the Americas in Trinidad and Tobago, he talked about there being no senior and junior partners, and I think we've shown that we mean that. And throughout the first term, the focus was to establish a new architecture of cooperation based on shared mutual responsibility and a shared respect for our neighbors. That sounds trite, but it's incredible and important in its implications. And we've shown that we actually that we mean what we say. The Cuban policy change is perhaps the best example that when we say we're going to do something, we are going to do it. The focus of the vice president, and he frames it, his kind of top line theme is a hemisphere that is secure, democratic, and middle class. We're actually trying to focus on policies that kind of get us there, promote that direction. Unfortunately, that's not a reality for everybody in the hemisphere. And so what we've been doing is, as we get to this kind of, you could call it legacy consolidation period for this administration, what we've been looking at is where can we devote serious energy to actually developing a long-term direction for U.S. Western Hemisphere relations on key issue sets. Cuba is one of them, of course. But that's taken the front page. What folks haven't seen is that we've been investing a lot of energy in the economic relationship with Mexico, because when Mexico prospers, the United States prospers. We've actually supported this historic peace, negotiations between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. In Central America, the president requested $1 billion in fiscal year 2016 because we believe that if we invest in the region's prosperity and security, it's a better investment than actually investing in processing migrants that come here to the United States. It's a better bet. It's a no-brainer. In the Caribbean, it's exactly the same thing. But the common theme throughout those is that the United States, the president and the vice president, will invest serious political will equal to the same level of political will that is invested by the region's government. So I'm incredibly optimistic. The vice president is, in his engagement with these leaders, incredibly optimistic that we have that opportunity. And so we actually think really great things are going to come of this. And I think when you see the president go to the Summit of the Americas in April, all this is going to kind of come together. We have some tricks up our sleeves that I'm not going to get ahead of the White House on this, obviously. But he's going to come ready to address all of these issues when he goes to Panama. Ultimately, we want to achieve that goal of a hemisphere that is secure, middle class, and democratic. Thank you.
Thank you. Panel members, you've opened a lot of boxes, spurred some curiosity, put aside some issues, and sharpened and clarified others. So please join me all in thanking our panel for this meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.